The demographic collapse that claimed millions of African lives between 1884 and 1920 followed a formalized blueprint, an architecture of erasure. In 1880, 90% of the African continent was governed by sovereign, centralized political entities. These powers included the Asante Empire with its complex bureaucracy, the Sokoto Caliphate's vast Islamic federation, and the Buganda Kingdom's parliamentary governance. This map shows Africa's organic borders. By 1900, the continent was partitioned into rigid, geometric blocks of European control. This transition relied on cartographic fiction. Diplomats treated inhabited territories as empty spaces, drawing boundaries that ignored ethnic and political reality. The result was a paper genocide, the systematic removal of African political evolution from the international legal record. The formalization of this legal erasure occurred at the Berlin West Africa Conference of 1884. Under the direction of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, 14 imperial powers gathered to regulate the partitioning of the continent. No African ruler or diplomat was invited. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia wrote letters protesting any division of territory without African consent, but his diplomatic appeals were entirely ignored by the delegates in Berlin. The conference produced the General Act of 1885. While its preamble used humanitarian language about protecting native populations, the actual text established the rules for future prise de possession, seizures of possession. The core legal mechanism was Article 34, which introduced the requirement for effective occupation to claim territory. This doctrine dictated that a European power could claim sovereignty simply by demonstrating physical presence, raising a flag, building a fort, or deploying troops. It legally nullified pre-existing African customary law and decades of established diplomatic protocols. Vibrant sovereign kingdoms were legally downgraded to native populations, objects of European negotiation rather than subjects recognized under international law. Seizing inhabited land required a philosophical loophole, the doctrine of terra nullius, or nobody's land. This concept was supported by prominent European thinkers like Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. In his lectures, Hegel classified sub-Saharan Africa as entirely unhistorical, existing beyond the reach of human development. The justification was further reinforced by John Locke's labor theory of property. Locke argued that land not improved through European-style agricultural enclosure remained in a state of nature and could be justly appropriated. This flowchart illustrates how Hegelian ahistoricism and Lockean labor theory combined to create the legal fiction of terra nullius. This logic deliberately delegitimized African pastoralist and communal tenure systems, allowing colonial administrations to declare populated regions as wastelands available for seizure. Social Darwinism then turned this theft into a natural, inevitable biological process. It framed the displacement of weak societies by the so-called fittest races as a law of nature. By defining the continent as dark and timeless, European empires successfully repackaged military conquest as a moral and civilizing mission. With the land legally cleared, colonial administrations built an economic engine to extract its value, primarily by forcing the population into a wage labor economy. The primary tool was the hut tax. By taxing the dwelling in cash, currency most Africans did not possess, hundreds of thousands of these men were funneled into labor sinks, primarily the Kimberley diamond fields and the Transvaal gold mines. Medical reports from these closed compounds revealed the human cost. Annual mortality rates routinely reached 75 to 100 deaths per 1,000 workers due to silicosis, pneumonia, and physical exhaustion. African men were treated as disposable batteries required to process mineral wealth, worked until they were physically broken and then replaced. The removal of prime-age males for extended periods caused agricultural production to plummet, birth rates to collapse, and families to deeply fragment. The hut tax effectively converted African time and survival into a quantifiable European profit margin. When taxation was not enough to enforce compliance, the colonial state deployed engineered famine to clear land and enforce resource quotas. The first model of this devastation occurred in the Congo Free State, the personal corporate domain of King Leopold II of Belgium. To extract wild rubber, the state imposed impossible monthly quotas. This forced farmers deep into the forests for weeks at a time, collapsing the agricultural cycles that had sustained 20 million people. To enforce quotas, state sentries utilized systematic terror. They brought back severed human hands as accounting proof that bullets hadn't been wasted. A second model emerged in German East Africa during the Maji Maji Rebellion, where the military explicitly used starvation to crush resistance. In 1905, German Governor von Goetzen issued directives to burn huts, destroy granaries, and trample crops. This scorched earth policy engineered a famine killing 300,000 people. The international community was not ignorant of these methods. Investigators like Roger Casement meticulously documented the scale of atrocities occurring in the Congo. Whether driven by corporate rubber quotas or military decrees, the destruction of food systems proved to be a highly successful strategy for territorial control. Alongside extraction, colonial territories functioned as laboratory Africa, zones where captive populations were used for toxic experimentation. In Cameroon and Togo, German medical officers launched mass campaigns testing experimental chemotherapy for sleeping sickness, relying heavily on a highly toxic arsenic-based compound called atoxyl. Doctors like Friedrich Klein prioritized pharmacological data over patient safety. They administered the drug despite knowing it frequently caused permanent blindness and fatal organ failure. Medical teams conducted what survivors remembered as needle terror, utilizing armed soldiers to round up entire villages and force them to receive the experimental injections. These trials resulted in an estimated 10,000 direct deaths and left another 30,000 permanently disabled, generating valuable data for German pharmaceutical firms. Under the banner of medical progress, colonial science turned the African body into a site for state-sponsored poisoning. The absolute convergence of this legal, philosophical, and medical architecture occurred in Namibia between the years of 1904 and 1908, with the genocide of the Herero and Nama people. Following an uprising against land expropriation, German forces issued a formal extermination order. They deliberately drove an estimated 60,000 Herero men, women, and children into the waterless Omahaki Desert to die of engineered thirst and starvation. Those who survived the brutal Omahaki Desert were eventually sent to Shark Island, a barren rocky outcrop in Lüderitz Bay that functioned as the 20th century's first modern concentration camp. Inside the camp, military doctors engaged in the skull trade, decapitating deceased prisoners and shipping their heads in preserving fluid to European universities for racial science. The camp administrators meticulously refined methods of mass incarceration, forced labor, and racial classification on the captive population. These camps were not an isolated colonial footnote. They were the testing grounds where the techniques of mass murder were formalized before eventually being exported back to Europe. The institutional link between these colonies and the Nazi medical apparatus is direct. It centers on Eugene Fischer, a German anthropologist who conducted racial experiments on the surviving prisoners in Namibia before returning to Berlin. The anthropometric measurements Fischer took on starving Herero and Nama captives provided the empirical data that would later form the baseline for Nazi racial hygiene policies. His 1913 monograph on racial mixing became a foundational text for the Nazi sterilization law. This diagram tracks the precise chain of custody. Data extracted from the Shark Island death registers was published in Fischer's academic texts, which then directly informed the drafting of Nazi sterilization legislation in 1933. Fischer later served as the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. His students and deputies, including the direct mentor of Josef Mengele, relied on these colonial presidents to normalize and scale mass human experimentation. The architecture of erasure built in Africa functioned exactly as designed, and was later optimized for the industrialized genocides of the mid-20th century. The direct lineage from Namibian concentration camps to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute places these colonial crimes at the center of the 20th century. Recognizing this record is the starting point for any discussion of global restitution.